In thinking about other developments in culture and society, there are a variety of places I could put Puritanism. We talked a little bit about Puritanism in politics. We could talk about it in doctrine and certainly talk about it in practice. But in thinking about culture and society, there are a couple of things to think about with how the Puritans looked at these two aspects of life. When they returned from Geneva, they found themselves mocked because of their strict interpretations of the Bible and morality. Right? They come home thinking under Elizabeth is going to reform the church, but they didn't reform all of the things that these Puritans, or also referred to as precisionists, wanted. They found themselves persecuted under James I and Charles I, sometimes even having their ears cut off. Essentially, Puritans had different views on the relationship to this antagonistic culture. There were some that were known as separatists. These separatists believed that the Church of England would not change, and so it needed to be abandoned. This is the group that flees to Holland in 1608 because of the religious tolerance of the Dutch. But Holland is also a very immoral place at the time as well, and they decide we don't want our children growing up here, so that's why they travel to English colonies in North America.
Excuse me, very what?
Immoral. Immoral.
How many more?
Immoral. A small group travels to the American colonies on the Mayflower in 1620. And if you grew up going to public school, or probably any school, you've heard the story of how they were to go to Virginia but ended up in New England. However, a very small number of those people on the Mayflower were actually separatists. There were only about 35. They were traveling with adventurers, members of the Church of England, and others. So it wasn't all Puritans or Pilgrims on the Mayflower. Half of them died. Of course, they faced a variety of challenges, and eventually the settlement was absorbed by Massachusetts Bay, which was made up of the second group of Puritans known as non-separatists. They might also be referred to as pragmatists. They decided to stay in the Church of England. They believed the church could reform. But the continued persecution eventually caused them to look to the colonies to escape. The group attained a royal charter for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but it also included an exemption that required leaving an office in England. Right? So if you went to establish colonies, usually it was required that at least some presence in England was required, but all the Puritans were allowed to go. A sizable group went. In those early years, they hoped to be a city on a hill. And this is the phrase that's used in early sermons, drawn from the Sermon on the Mount. The idea being, we'll go there, England will see what we're doing, and they'll recognize that we've been right all along. And perhaps we'll even return to England. Now, most colonies, like Jamestown, percentage-wise had more young, unmarried men focused on profit. Those were most of the people that went were trying to make their money. Massachusetts Bay, however, had families who were interested in settling and creating a social order that was stable. Much like Calvin, they believed in the establishment of holy commonwealths, these societies where the government enforced religious order and promoted religious practice. Moral offenders were seen as threats to the civil order. They faced punishment. And although we think of those Puritans and the Pilgrims as fleeing to the United States for religious freedom, they often did not allow religious freedom for others. Quakers, for example, were sometimes hung for being Quakers. Church attendance was mandatory. There were Sabbath laws against things like watching sports or doing business on Sundays. And they really saw themselves as kind of extending and enacting the narratives of the Bible in modern times. They talked about themselves as the Israelites escaping to the promised land from the Pharaoh. Despite the attempts of Puritans to try and establish this religiously uniform order, it was never completely eliminated. And there were a variety of people who stood against this attempt to enforce religious order in society. One of those was Roger Williams. Williams had started as a separatist. He would eventually become a non-separatist, and then would eventually leave Puritanism to become a Baptist. He would eventually leave the Baptist to become a seeker. Not like we think of it. A seeker was someone looking for an inner revelation, a direct revelation. Williams challenged the Puritan authorities in a variety of ways. He did not like this coercion of religious belief by the government, and he did not think that belief should be coerced. He believed that Native Americans had been treated unfairly by the Puritans. They'd taken their land. Ultimately, because of all these views, Williams was banished. He would establish the colony of Rhode Island, where dissenters from Massachusetts Bay were often exiled. Right? And so if you're a problem, we'll kick you out of Massachusetts Bay, you end up in Rhode Island. The Charter of Rhode Island pushed religious freedom, and Williams even went out of his way to purchase the land from the Native Americans. Another threat to social order was Anne Hutchinson. She moved to Boston in 1634, following a minister of the church back in England, and so her and her husband traveled. Trouble began with the Hutchinsons when Anne started speaking about religion in her home to mixed audiences. So the sermon would be talked about on Sunday, and then she would, throughout the week, meet with this group of people, talking about what was discussed in the sermons. Started out with women, but eventually it was male and female. So she gets into trouble because she was acting as a preacher instead of a congregant. Right? You're not a preacher, you're not a ordained preacher, so you should be not teaching, you should be listening. Also that she was acting like a husband instead of a wife. And the Puritan government and church also felt she was emphasizing grace too much and challenging the laws of society. She would have two trials, a civil trial and a religious one. The transcript from the civil trial still exists. You'll find it reprinted in a variety of anthologies. And as you read through it, it becomes obvious that the first day of the trial, Anne Hutchinson has the better of the people accusing her. She's kind of just asking a bunch of questions, and they cannot answer her questions. And so she's coming out on top. Things change, however, the second day, when she comes out and claims that God had directly spoken to her by an immediate voice. Like she had heard God just like Abraham had heard God. Well, if she hadn't said that, she might have still come out on top. But when you claim that you have heard God speak to you, for the Puritans, that was enough. She was accused of consorting with the devil. She was banished as a woman not fit for our society, and will die in an Indian attack in 1643. So disorder in this attempted stable order came from individuals like Roger Williams and Hutchinson, but also very disturbing for the Puritan order was witchcraft. Prevalent throughout this time was a belief that the supernatural often broke into the natural. People dabbled with astrology, with magic, with alchemy, with divination, all the while holding to notions of being Christian, right? So they're engaging in both of these aspects. But there was a belief that the supernatural was working in the lives of people. For the Puritans especially, God and Satan both used those type of almost supernatural ways. People would give things like comets or earthquakes of divine reading. Right? Earthquakes are God's punishment. Comets are God warning us about something. But there was a difference between God's miracles, which were supernatural, and Satan's wonders, which were deceptive. So essentially, the Puritans at this time lived in a world of wonders. Right? There was constant belief that the divine was operating, and that the supernatural was active, but there were forces for good and forces for evil. Ultimately, witchcraft is the one that becomes the most concerted. Why witchcraft? Well, witchcraft was conceived of as being the upsetting of social order. It overthrew what God intended. But it was also a threat to social order because it became an outlet for class tensions, right? The lower classes rebelling against the higher classes. The women accused in Salem, for example, had been people who inherited their husband's wealth. Women with economic independence, and their accusers were servants, farmers' daughters, the daughter of a disgruntled minister. Right? So there's all sorts of things where witchcraft is throwing off this social order. The most famous case of witchcraft hysteria in the United States is the Salem break in 1692-1693. There had been witchcraft concerns before, there were witchcraft concerns after. Witchcraft in Europe was a constant concern, but most people have heard of Salem, Massachusetts. Some of it was a reflection between the difference between Salem village and Salem town. There appears to have been some resentment between the people in the village toward the people in the town. And that is evidenced in some of these accusations as well. From February of 1692 to April of 1693, hundreds were arrested, 160 were accused, 50 of them confessed to being witches, which usually led to your life being spared. So they probably weren't actually witches, but wanted to get out of prison or escape being executed. In the end, 19 women were hanged. One man, who was the former minister of Salem, was brought back, tortured, and killed by being pressed together between two stones. 5 others died in jail. A lot of things happened. We don't have the time to talk about it, but it was really kind of interesting in thinking about all this back and forth and how absurd some of these things got. As I mentioned, a lot of the accusers were farmers' daughters, lower class women, young girls, accusing these older, wealthier women. And during the trials, as the accused would be brought in, the accuser would suddenly act like they were being attacked. Right? So you have this performance at trial that was often very much believed because these are young children. How could they be lying? They claimed to see like almost astral projections of these people. Right? Their specter is coming and attacking me. Right? This is what's causing. And this spectral evidence was allowed in trial. Right, that supposedly these girls had seen these specters of this person who's sitting there before everybody, but now there's specters coming over here and pinching me and doing all sorts of things to me. In October 1692, the governor of the colony, Governor Phipps, ended the special witchcraft court, even though the subsequent proceedings lasted until April. It's possible that he got involved when his own wife had been questioned for being a witch. But eventually it all died down. The names of some of those condemned and executed were later cleared. One of the girls, 10 years later, would ask for forgiveness for being deluded into accusing innocent people. Let's move on to talking about doctrine, some of the changes in doctrine during this time. One of the major ones developing at this time is in response to Calvinism and the theology of Jacob Arminius and what's known as Arminianism. Arminius was born to well-to-do Dutch parents, and he had actually studied in Geneva with one of Calvin's most prominent students. He would eventually return to Holland, become an important preacher in the city of Amsterdam. There was a theologian in the region who had rejected some of the tenets of the Calvinist view, and so Arminius is called upon to debate him. But as he studies his opponent's position, he becomes convinced that his opponent is correct, that the things he's challenging are correct. Particularly problematic for Arminius is the issue of predestination and this attendant issue, election. Now, ultimately, Arminius promotes an idea of predestination, but it's very similar to the Catholic view, in that God foreknew those who would have faith, and thus chose them. Right? Where the Calvinist view was, God didn't look into the future, he just chose. Right? He just chose, based on his own choice. In addition, he kind of took some positions that are very similar to the Anabaptists, in that predestination was more about choosing Jesus as the Redeemer than it was about the salvation or condemnation of individuals. In other ways, he remained like Calvin, so there's just a few places where he disagreed. He would die in 1609, but others took up his cause. Particularly, they focused on 5 issues. The first was predestination. Predestination should not be a subject for endless speculation. It's not very clear, so don't spend all your time speculating. Secondly, in contrast to the Calvinist view, the Arminian view said Jesus died for all human beings. Right? That his death could be effected for anybody, but they had to become a believer. He also supported the idea that God's grace was wholly necessary. Right? So human beings can't do anything good. He's not Pelagian. He's not saying, right, there's a power within human beings to, get your own grace. Furthermore, in contrast to the Calvinist view, he believed that grace was resistible. An individual could choose to turn away from grace. And finally, he could not commit to the idea of the perseverance of the saints. The perseverance of the saints. The idea of once saved, always saved. Right? So because grace is resistible, you could choose to reject it after having become a believer. Why you would want to is one thing, but it was possible. Well, after his death, there is this Arminian party in Holland and a Calvinist party in Holland that are kind of going 2 separate directions. And so the Synod of Dort is called. This is called to kind of put an end to the debate. But it's largely shaped by Calvinist interests. Most of the people showing up were Calvinist or Reformed. The Synod condemns the Arminian view, but instead postulates 5 important points of Calvinism that are remembered through the acronym TULIP. TULIP stands for these 5 points: total depravity, there's nothing good about human beings; unconditional election, God chose out of his own sovereignty who would be saved, who would be lost; limited atonement, Jesus' death is just for the elect, not for everybody; irresistible grace, if you were chosen for election, the Spirit would work upon you and you could not resist grace. You would be converted. And then finally, the perseverance of the saints, the once saved, always saved. These became the 5 important criteria or categories of Calvinism, although most Calvinists today, or most heirs of Calvinists today, predominantly focus on the last one, perseverance of the saints, and don't emphasize as much the others. You'll still find a lot of ministers in the Reformed tradition emphasizing them, but for most Calvinists on the ground, so to speak, once saved, always saved is the one that really focuses, or that's really focused upon. We are going to run out of time and not be able to cover everything, and so I'll send out an email letting you know what terms will not be on the final. But I do want to skip over the Westminster Confession of Faith and covenantal theology and talk about the origins of the Baptists, and this is where we'll end. The Baptist Church developed out of the separatist wing of Puritanism. And like a lot of groups, the Baptist name was applied to them and it stuck. It wasn't a name that was originally that they originally chose. John Smith, or Smythe, was an Anglican priest who gradually examined the views of Puritans and decided to become a separatist. But the separatist congregation he becomes a part of gradually gets so large they have to divide to escape notice. So Smith takes one group, the other group will serve as the core for the Pilgrims. Right? Remember, these are separatist Puritans at this time. Both groups go to Holland, the Netherlands, to escape persecution from James I. Eventually, the group led by Smith comes into contact with Dutch Mennonites. It's unclear how much influence they have, but later developments mirror some Anabaptist teaching, including immersion as the form of baptism. Eventually, Smith will become against the idea of reading the Bible in translation. He will only preach from the Greek and Hebrew and translate while preaching. He also becomes convinced that infant baptism is not valid. Additionally, he comes to the belief that the church was constituted by covenant, not any profession of faith in Christ. So, the only thing he sees in Scripture is that you become a member of the church by expressing your faith in Christ. However, the separate church he's a part of says you engage in this covenant and everybody works together and those kinds of things. So it's decided, we're going to disband this church and we're going to reform as a church where members have joined because of the profession of faith in Jesus. And so instead of this covenant view that was important for Puritans, he begins teaching believers' baptism. He baptizes himself first, but still at this point they are not to immersionists, so he pours water over himself and then baptizes the other congregants. Smith would also become convinced that Christians should be complete pacifists and not take oaths, but not everybody agrees. Thomas Hullis, for example, a lawyer who had funded the trip to Amsterdam, breaks with Smith over this and leads a group back to England to establish a church there. This group is often referred to as General Baptists because their beliefs are largely Arminian in nature. Salvation is available for everyone. It's possible to lose that salvation. By the middle of the 17th century, there were 47 congregations in the area around London. In the non-separatist wing of Puritanism, another group of Baptists developed. Right? So general Baptists come from the separatist wing. Particular Baptists come from the non-separatist wing. It develops in the 1630s. Eventually, this group, too, would question infant baptism. They were called particular Baptists because they held a more Calvinist view of salvation. Right? So predestination, election. By the 1640s and 1650s, these Baptists have moved to immersion as the appropriate form of baptism. But they still prefer not to use the name Baptist. They want simply to be called Christian or Brethren. They didn't want the Anabaptist label, but of course Baptist is what sticks. While the Baptist churches were congregational, meaning that authority was only in the local congregation, they often would group together in a variety of Baptist associations. Usually these were regional. However, the general Baptists looked at these associations as having some authority. The particular Baptists, however, didn't give the associations much authority. And so the general Baptists moved much more quickly into the denominational mode with a series of hierarchies than the particular Baptists, because they believed that they were just associations. We're just associating with other congregations. The association has no authority over others. As I mentioned, I'll send out an email telling you what terms on the study guide you don't need to know for the exam, because we didn't get through everything. And don't forget, the exam coming up